Hi, this is Ed Kohler with Extreme Networks, and I'm here today to talk with you about ransomware and how you can secure your enterprise or organization against it. Before we can do that, though, let's talk about the ransomware landscape. Ransomware has been around for a while, but it is a very rapidly changing cybersecurity landscape, and it's wise to look at some of the newer trends that are evolving in this arena. But let's give a definition first. Ransomware is malware code, and that's pure and simple. It's not a miasma. It's not some sort of vampire that creeps under the door at night. It's malware code, pure and simple, which means it can be stopped. It can be tracked. It can be identified. It's just like any other type of malware. So we tend to put a mythological status around ransomware because of its impact, and that's one of the things we'll talk about is really mitigating the penetration of the code is the main strategy here to minimize the impact of any pertinent infiltration infection. Now, the code here is intended to infiltrate and infect systems with the intention of encrypting all content in store. Now, I want to emphasize that that's regardless of whether it's located locally on the device, i.e. a local hard drive, or remotely mounted, such as a mirroring or continuous data protection, data dedupe, things of that nature. And you have to realize that really you can't have online backups and expect them to be protected. Also, alternative forms have evolved. And what do I mean by that? There are forms of ransomware that do not infect systems. They just hold something in a denial of service state and then hold you in ransom. So imagine a building infrastructure system or even your home residence where someone gains control of it and shuts off power, shuts off everything, and then holds you for ransom until you pay your money. These are different. And by the way, there was a power grid outage in Europe, which actually did that. And at that point, it really wasn't looking for monetary exchange. It was making a political statement and to try to coerce a given national government to decide things in a particular way. So we have to realize that ransomware is a pretty broad subject. But typically, the victim is then held with the threat of code deletion or the distribution of the data onto the dark web, where it would be sold. The attack is usually very fast. And again, this is typical, but it's not always. And this is another aspect we're going to cover. It's intended to push the victim into a paying decision as quickly as possible. And by the way, that is the case even in varieties of attacks. And there's also the threat of substantial raising of the ransom price or deletion of data or selling of the data after a very short delay. So, they don't give you a lot of time. They really want you to pay the ransom up front. Now, in a lot of ways, the typical form is typically cryptocurrency. If we look at some of the older forms of ransomware, it was actually a lot harder and more complex for ransom to actually be paid. We're going to talk about that as well. So a little history here. Ransomware is not new, but it is changing rapidly. And it was first created in, as far as we know, 1989, PC Cyborg. The ransom needed to literally be wired to an anonymous or offshore account or something of that nature, or it had to be bag dropped like in a dumpster or something like that. So pretty much old school. Since that time, new technologies have enabled the increased sophistication of both the code and the methods of the code. So first of all, the infection vectors, they have become much more varied. Obviously, in 1989, the web did not exist as we know it. And I know that for a fact because I was working in the industry at the time. It was nascent. It was it was not a widespread phenomenon. Water holes have evolved since then because obviously the World Wide Web has become a very prevalent type of phenomenon. Almost everyone who has any type of electronic device uses it. So it becomes a very attractive place. The other aspect is phishing. Email, exchanges, things like that. But also remember, you can actually be phished through SMS texting. In other areas, perhaps normal individuals could actually be contributing or contracting ransomware, but they're not doing it through a proper corporate email type service. So remember, phishing can have multiple forms. It doesn't always have to be email. Also, the prevalence and rise of Android and iOS and the overall BYOD phenomenon. And then finally, in a very important piece that we'll talk about throughout this presentation is the IoT vector. That is becoming very, very important and needs to be addressed quickly if you really want to protect yourselves. Now, the payment vectors is the other area. Remember what I said earlier is that, the ransomware needed to be wired or dropped. Well, with the rise of the Bitcoin and the dark web, being anonymous and forcing payment through some sort of cyber currency has become the major trend. Now, this gives a basic timeline of ransomware. I want to emphasize that I'm only showing the big press release code. If I listed all forms of ransomware, the slide would be really just packed full of text. So I chose not to do that. I really just wanted to show a timeline and the indication that after the rise of iOS and Android, with Android released in 2008, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the iPhone released in 2007, rise of Bitcoin in 2010, the release and public access to the dark web in 2004, and still continuing, you can see that the use or the variety of ransomware has increased. And again, if I really fleshed out this slide, you would see that it is tandem to the increase in BYOD, IoT, and the rise of the dark web. And obviously, it all culminates with the latest press of WannaCry. And by the way, WannaCry is not gone away yet. Now, what do we expect in 2020 and beyond? Well, obviously, IoT and ransomware. I said this is a big target and it needs to be looked at very, very closely from a security perspective, but also adversarial machine learning. The good guys aren't the only ones that are using ML and AI. And when you tandem that with botnets and the ability to have some sort of ML capability, this can be a very, very dangerous thing. Cryptojacking, the use of corporate assets to do crypto mining for things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, that's going to be a major trend. It already is. Mobile malware, obviously, particularly in Android, very, very high, and an increase up 54%. And then also a general increase in infrastructure targets. And many times some of this may be nation, state, or politically based. Now, first, before we talk about this new IoT threat, let's talk about the traditional ransomware methodologies. You have phishing and water holing. Those are basically the two methods. And note how both of them require a human to do something. They either have to click on an email with a malicious link or attachment, or they are going to a malicious website and they have to, actually visit that site. So either way, I have to coerce the human to do something. But notice the similarity in the chain. Once the ransomware payload is down, there's an establishment of a command and control infrastructure, and then the encryption of the data. And that at that point, the C2 infrastructure allows the ability for the potential release of the encryption if the ransom is paid. And that's the use and reason why the C2 needs to be exist. And keep in mind, that's an important forensic piece to keep in mind with this type of code. Now, the botnet factor. Again, I said WannaCry is not over yet. It is not something that passed. It actually is being morphed and will morph, just like all malware in the future. Mirai is also not the only botnet you should be worried about. But I'm going to kind of focus on these two here because it's an interesting phenomenon. Because the theory here is that I can infect one and then spread to the many via IoT. And if I do that, then I can get a very deep vector of infection into the target, and the attacker does not have to have the human interaction at all. I can do it without any human interaction. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to. And this is just a somewhat humorous slide, which I like to put into most of my presentations because I really do get a kick out of it. But also it brings home a point that as we make more prevalent IoT smart devices into our homes and our businesses, this becomes a very attractive vector for ransomware and also all other forms of malware as well. Now, to take this home on a more serious note, the Mirai botnet launched probably what is the largest DDoS attack yet on the internet. And it took control of smart devices like security cameras all over the world, turning them into basically zombies. And then at that point, there was a particular point in time where a trigger was set and the DDoS attack was launched. And it took down popular websites like Netflix, Twitter, eBay was severely infected. And all of these enterprises were taken down for significant portions of time. But also keep in mind, they were never attacked direct because the DDoS attack was against the the DNS service provider. And so when you take out DNS, we all know what happens. You lose the internet. So these enterprises were never attacked directly. I used this example last year in my perfect storm presentation. This actually is a more prevalent view of what a perfect storm attack could look like. Because now Mirai is being improved. Like all malware, once it enters into the wild, nation states and criminals can enter the picture and they can improve on the code. Yes, absolutely. New features, 11 new exploits, bringing the total to 27. And yes, ransomware is among them. New propagation and obfuscation methods, which allows the code to propagate and also hide. New credentials for brute force, for system hacking, and extension of target lists, infrastructure systems, and enterprise systems. This is something we need to pay attention to. And also take note of the box inset, IoT Linux botnets to continue to expand their attack surface. We need to pay attention to this attack vector because most IoT systems are very lightweight Linux devices or VxWorks. Cyber threat levels continue to increase. And this is, I just want to take a couple notes on these slides. First of all, the number of the IoT devices. That's pretty staggering. Also, moving over to the center of the slide, 20% of organizations have observed at least one IoT-based attack in the last 3 years. Now move down, 5 minutes. Average time to breach an IoT device, particularly if it has the default passwords on. Now move over to the upper left-hand side, 68% of breaches take months or longer to discover. These are bad numbers. Anybody with a security architecture background would know that these are very bad numbers. This is an open attack vector in every sense of the word. So where do we start? It seems to be a big problem, but actually, like all problems, if you break it down, you always find that the answer is tractable. Because again, I want to return to the fact that ransomware is nothing more than malware code. Therefore, it can be identified, it can be eliminated and quarantined. Now, first step, be sure to have offline backups for your critical systems. And when I say offline, I mean offline. Offline and in an archived state. Now, obviously, the timeline of the backups should be calculated ahead of time. In other words, more critical systems, you may want to have offline backups as recent as 15 minutes. Now, what this implies is this can't happen on the front-end systems. This has to happen on the array storage on the back end. So what you have to do, and by the way, this technology does exist, the ability to take existing snapshots off the existing stores, whether continuous data protection or mirroring or whatever, and actually archive off within the data array. And yes, there is extra cost on this, but you don't have to have archives reaching back months. You only need the last few recent snaps. And that way, if something does happen, you can rehydrate a system. You may lose 10 or 15 minutes, but at least you can rehydrate a system and get back into working order without the need to pay the ransom. So this is a very, very key piece. Many people assume that if they're just running a back-end array, that they're protected. That's not correct. The archives have to be offline, which means they have to be pulled off the array. Now that could be automated, or it can be something a human can do. It's all a matter of practice and policy on how that gets established, but it's important to realize that those backups have to be totally offline. Now, the other aspect is the prevention piece, because that was reaction. We're assuming you've already been hacked. Educate your staff and end users. Make sure they know what a phishing campaign looks like, what a malicious website would look like, certain do's and don'ts, and where to go and where not to go on the web. Perhaps even get that established in a policy on your system machines. Educate your staff as far as looking for suspicious behavior, suspicious actions, particularly with some of the information that I'm going to talk about coming on in the next few slides, because really catching the malware early is the key. That way you're dealing with a fairly small infection footprint, and your need or the pressure to pay some sort of ransom is thus very much minimized as that result. Now, the last thing is enforce proper security practices. Now, this is going to be a big focus here because obviously the third vector, which doesn't require any human interaction, really, this is the only way we can really effectively protect against that, because education can help, but it only helps for phishing and malicious websites and things of that nature. Here, when you have an IoT device, we can't train IoT devices to recognize things. So they are sitting in the network, and most of them are fairly dumb. They are fairly open. Many of them, if you haven't made provision ahead of time, have their default passwords. And by the way, many IoT devices, even after you alter the passwords, the default password's still there on the back end. So investigate that. Now, this is a list of what we're going to talk about bolstering network security. I'm not going to focus here. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go into each individual category. First of all, risk assessment. Know what is in your network. 61% of people surveyed indicated that they have no idea what is in their network. They could not provide a complete assessment. Now, in my mind, if you can't see something and you don't know it's there, you can't secure it. So IT, OT, and IoT environments are very key. Make sure that you look at your operational technology, your production floors, if you happen to be manufacturing, and almost everyone has IoT environments. Don't forget those. Make sure you enumerate them. Make sure you do a vulnerability assessment. And by the way, identify any vulnerabilities and address them. And then, of course, you should do the same for the normal IT environment. Now, prioritization, that's another key. Many times risk assessments become overwhelming. You need to prioritize. And one of the things I would urge is that you need to look at IoT very quickly. You need to get that enumerated, assessed, and do a vulnerability analysis against those environments very quickly. And don't be afraid to hire outside resources to assist you in that. That sometimes is a very key thing. And obviously, we can provide that type of service, and we also have partners that can provide that type of service as well. Visibility. Again, I said 61% of professionals had no to low confidence that they knew what was connected. You really have to have the visibility, and this is really where application telemetry becomes a critical piece to securing the infrastructure. Because really, more traffic is going east and west. And obviously, at the network edge, at the ingress port is where it's all happening. That's where the first propagation of malware and the first infection point is going to occur. Therefore, having application telemetry at that level is very, very key to catching something early and preventing its propagation. Now, centralized firewalls are very good for north-south traffic, yes, but they're kind of blind to this lower-level east-west thing. And application telemetry can not only give you the ability to get a better profile of what's going on in your network from an application performance perspective and network performance perspective, but also to look for anomalies that indicate some sort of malware propagation east-west within a given segment. Policy. Again, firewalls have very limited effectiveness for east-west traffic within the within the segment. Policy-based network segmentation is key. Strong base policy access control, locking down environments, having rules, and what we have found is the best approach for IoT is a whitelist profile, and also OT devices as well in most instances. The important thing to realize is that most of these types of devices are very consistent in the way they behave, and they do it 24/7, 365 days a week. They should really never change their profile. So if they do something outside of the whitelist, that actually should be flagged as an anomaly, and you should be investigating that as quickly as possible. So we also want to have the application telemetry to provide strong monitoring of systems, both into and out of the segments. And by the way, firewalls can complement in that. And I will talk about the security ecosystem towards the end, because it's very important that we take the knowledge that we're gaining with application telemetry and the policy gating that we're doing at the edge and sharing that with the firewall, because that creates a cohesive security ecosystem. Isolation and segmentation between IoT, OT, and IT. Very, very key. Strong access controls into and out of these isolated environments. Audit trails, because now you have the ability to track your assets according to their domains of interest. Tiered environments, both within and between. That is key, because this slows or even can prevent the propagation of malware, particularly if you have an IoT segment that is isolated. There is no way for it to propagate out of the IoT domain. When you have tiered environments, and let's say you have a master firewall or a series of chains of demarcations, then it allows you to at least slow the propagation, and so you can cut it off. And that has actually been done by some of our customers. So here we show surveillance, imaging, PCI, and EMR shown as individual segments separating the actual domains of interest very effectively. This is really the way that you can create an environment that would be the difference between just a simple incident of infection and a total catastrophe where it propagates throughout your whole system environment. Compliance, very key. We focus on automating this for you. And this is an important thing, but I want to emphasize that compliance does not mean security, okay? Compliance is an important component to security, but it is not security in itself. But it is, however, one of those things that need to be done, and if you keep your compliance profiles, then you are more secure. There's no doubt about that. So I want to emphasize where this fits in the overall hierarchy of things. But it also is something that is fairly repetitive, and it's something that lends itself consequently well to automation. So we do that for you, and we can automate compliance reporting, and this kind of eliminates all of the manual audits and errors that we humans will have to go through. Cloud security is another big thing, obviously in the public arena, but also many clouds are private now within enterprises, or they're hybrid where they're actually exchanged and they have a public a cloud service, kind of attached into a private hosted domain. Data compliance is obviously a very big thing here. Regulatory requirements are a very good thing here to be paying attention to. And keep in mind that what I mean by data compliance, make sure that you have classification of your data so that is it confidential? Is it internal? Is it public? Is it intended to be forward facing? These are the things that you need to do, and you have to formulate some sort of universal type of classification, and there are several different methods to have that. I would recommend referencing CISSP recommendations. There are military versions and enterprise versions and commerce versions of data compliance classification. But the other point is that once that's compliant, make sure data goes where it's supposed to. And if something shouldn't be on the public cloud, make sure it doesn't. Regulatory requirements obviously are directly tandem to this. When you're dealing with, particularly with personal information, we have to pay attention to things like HIPAA, GDPR, things of that nature. Business continuity and disaster recovery is a very common use of cloud, but I want to emphasize again, if your cloud backup is being used, make sure you have copies that are offline. Online storage is just as vulnerable to ransomware as the systems themselves. So you do make sure, even if you're using cloud, it does not make you safe. You really do have to do the offline backups, so make sure that you're doing that. Emerging technologies is a big area where Extreme has done a lot of research, and I've been more than honored to be involved in that. Basically, we can leverage new technologies because, again, I hate to be repetitive on this, but the firewalls lack that lower level east-west visibility. So application telemetry at the network edge is really optimal for that visibility. Now, what we can do is we can take that and put that into an analytics engine and basically leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning and come up with basically a summary of behavioral analytics. Now, obviously, this is much easier for IoT devices, but it's not something that's intractable for human beings either. So that is one of the areas where we're doing R&D. So emerging technologies, stay tuned, a lot coming from Extreme Networks in this area. Now, regardless of what we do, and regardless of who the vendor is, no one vendor can address security alone. Really, it's all about a cohesive, open ecosystem. And if we can do that, then we can get an open exchange of information of actionable knowledge. And it's really just a simple piece. The network has to become an active participant in the security ecosystem. Now, to put a testament to that, this is a quick look at our technology partner ecosystem, and as you can see, it covers different areas of interest in the center circle. Obviously, this is a limited list, and I do want to emphasize that we couldn't fit all of the partners on this slide, but do note that this is a big piece to our overall strategy, and we do this basically through Extreme Connect. Now, I want to kind of step away from Extreme for a second and talk about some open system resources that are available. First of all, CI security, critical information security controls. As you can see, this is a grouping of security practices. And within each group, there are best practices in the areas of wireless access control, account monitoring and control, the limited control of network ports, protocols, and services. Obviously, Extreme Networks focuses in many of these areas, but also this is where the ecosystem comes in as well, because if you look at the previous slide, you can see that we cover pretty much all of the groupings that are in CI security by these different partnerships. Now, the one exception, obviously, is the one I want to highlight now, is organizational on the far right-hand side. That's where the humans come in. This is where we just have to take human effort and due diligence, implement a security awareness and training program. That is really, really key. I highlighted that on earlier. And by the way, we at Extreme are very, very active in that. We actually run phishing campaigns on our own employees, and we provide friendly advice to those that do happen to click on the attachments or the links. Application software security. This basically goes to any in-house development that you're doing to make sure that people are doing best practices. Incident response and management, that's another key aspect. And then finally, penetration testing, red teaming your own environment. Again, these are all organizational good best practices that should be followed. I also want to highlight the Cloud Security Alliance. If you are planning to move to the cloud, or if you are already in the cloud, I would urge you to look at this organization. They are a great resource for best practices, and they also provide a good community of interaction so that you can talk to other folks who have moved and can perhaps give you advice of the do's and don'ts and things you should probably avoid. And then finally, I want to highlight the MITRE ATT&CK defense framework. This is one of my favorite friends. Now, I want to emphasize that this is basically a cyber adversary taxonomy, okay? And when people go to it, the feedback I get is that they get overwhelmed. And it is overwhelming. It's a massive matrix that basically follows through the MITRE attack sequence. And the important thing to realize, though, is that while it is overwhelming and very, very comprehensive, it is constantly updated. And the way you use this tool is basically to create an adversary model, such as what we've been talking about here. For instance, IoT being used as an attack vector to use ransomware and then move into the environment and propagate into end user systems, perhaps. Now you have an adversary model. Now you can take that and compare that against the framework and look at potential methods that an attacker may use. And what this does is this brings wider awareness to the tools. It gives wider awareness to the signatures that you should be looking for to identify potential attacks that are happening within your organization. And while we're doing that, let's take a quick look at things to look for, because again, detecting anomalies early can prevent propagation, and that's an important part to this. It's often been said that prevention is an ideal. In security, though, detection is an absolute must. So we need to detect anomalies. So 15 indicators of compromise here. This is a handy list to use and compare with MITRE ATT&CK. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will give you a second or two to read them. Obviously, you can also freeze the video and take a snapshot or write it down. Yes, we still do have pens and pencils. But the point is that these are things that you can look for. Now, seeing one of these, it might not necessarily indicate malicious behavior, but it should be investigated. However, when you see particular systems that correlate in 2 or 3 categories across this list, that's something that's really ratcheting up the possibility or the probability that something malicious is going on, and you should be looking at it as soon as possible. Now, obviously, like all things, we talked about DNS, but we also talked about the fact that DNS was a viable attack vector as well earlier. So we want to talk about DNS risk and vulnerabilities. Lock down your systems to prevent local DNS settings. That's one of the first things that many malware will do, is they will reset the DNS settings and cause the system to go elsewhere. And believe it or not, many users will not check that, and they will be led to malicious websites as a result. Lock down systems to prevent installation and use of third-party VPNs. Particularly no split tunnel behaviors. You can't monitor split tunnel behaviors. Any system that's doing split tunneling, you should be asking why, particularly an IoT device, but the end user systems as well. And if the end user is unaware of the behavior, that's something that should indicate, and really, really cause alarm. Lock down your firewalls to allow DNS queries from local DNS systems, which basically means lock down port 53 unless it's from a trusted source. Look at questionable patterns within your DNS logs. Separate traffic. Separate traffic. It allows you to actually analyze separate domains of interest in it that will allow you to, first of all, isolate the domains to prevent propagation, but it will also allow you to identify the infection vector earlier. If you have them separate, you can do that. If you don't, then it's just one holistic mess, which, as I talked about earlier, can actually happen very, very quickly. And at that point, you have a massive infection, a massive encryption happening, and your pressure to pay the ransom will be that much higher. Also, beware of any Tor activity, the dark web. Now, the dark web is a legal activity. I want to emphasize that. It was created actually by the US government for espionage activity, and the code was released. And by the way, Tor stands for the onion router, which kind of gives you the concept of how you can get that anonymity. But basically, the dark web is not illegal, but really, it should not be used in your organization. And if it is, you should be asking why. Okay, the only legitimate thing that I would think would be that you have a red teamer who needs access to Tor. And at that point, I would urge that he does that in a lab environment that is offline from the typical enterprise domain. Now, extreme networks, again, us or ourselves, we provide an end-to-end comprehensive set of tools to help you accomplish all of the things that we talked about, ranging from endpoint security all the way up to AI, ML-assisted security. And in the middle, we have wireless intrusion protection, IoT security, cloud security, segmentation and isolation and compliance. We have run numerous hackathons with our infrastructure without a single breach. And we plan on doing this on a repetitive basis. We just ran a hackathon not too long ago in the West Coast area, and we'll be doing another one very soon down south in South America. So this is something that we do on a regular basis. We've done it for about a decade now, so we're fairly confident in the security that Fabric Connect provides as a networking fabric technology. Now, this is a look at a different perspective, if you will, of the Extreme portfolio. Notice we have Extreme Compliance, that automation tool that I talked about for PCI, HIPAA, GDPR, Analytics, AI Security, Fabric Connect, Extreme Air Defense, which is that wireless IPS, Defender for IoT, which is a particular system which can protect and lock down an IoT environment and provide you a comprehensive asset inventory as well, Extreme Control, and also Extreme Cloud, which are both of our NAC offerings within the portfolio. And then notice how below we also show our partner elements, very key in order to create a complete security building block infrastructure. And then again, which is you probably know, but if you don't, Extreme Networks acquired Aerohive, and Aerohive brought a very mature cloud security model that was true third generation. We have taken that and we're quickly moving into a fourth generation, and that will be culminating very quickly. But as you can see, we have various security measures that we use within our own cloud service offerings for network as a service in order to provide a lockdown environment and to create the prevention of propagation of malware code and infection. It also provides a very good scale for AI leverage, and this is another important thing, is this gives us the elastic compute store in the cloud to actually run some of the analytics that we need to do. But in order to really do that, we need to secure the access to the underlying computing infrastructure and actually lock it down. And this allows us, these approaches allow us to do that. Now, I do want to emphasize that we are the only networking cloud vendor that actually is truly ISO certified. Many are struggling to attain it, but we have attained it. We are also third generation, moving to fourth, whereas most vendors are in second generation trying to struggle to third. And then, of course, the additional AWS security measures as well provide a fairly comprehensive security footprint in the cloud extension for Extreme Networks. So to wrap up, similar to my message last year, IoT, BYOD, and cloud, they are the new attack vectors. It actually, after looking at the numbers, it kind of is a no-brainer. Therefore, you should be performing regular risk assessments in these domains of interest. You should segment or even isolate IoT devices if you can. Many people tell me it's not possible, but after we have an extended conversation, we find that there is really no rational reason for them to have it tied into the normal enterprise network. Policy controls, access in and out of segments, that's very, very key. Application telemetry can help you look for anomalous traffic within a segment, again, catching something early minimizes the impact. Also realize that security is an open ecosystem, and that should include the network. Make sure you leverage that. Who is your firewall vendor? Who is your IPS vendor? Get them to the table. Create a comprehensive plan together. Adopt a layered and open approach to security. And by the way, leverage Extreme Connect, which is the API set that we have in XMC that we've established integration with some of the partners that you saw on the previous slide. Utilize CIS controls, utilize the Cloud Security Alliance, and utilize the MITRE ATT&CK framework. They're fantastic tools, and they're completely free. How can you go wrong? Now, finally, be sure to implement offline backups for your critical stores, and make sure they're fairly consistent. Make sure they're offline in an archived state. Train users on security best practices. Run phishing campaigns, run educational programs so that your users are more able to recognize something that's funny or something that's malicious and be able to alert and react against it. Thank you very much for your time. I wish you luck in the future, and hopefully, if you follow these practices, even if you do get infected, the impact will be minimal.